saving association, saving investment organizations or associations. They were not at all banks, and they were not licensed like as banks. They were not treated as banks. They did not have the nature of banks, but we've always thought of them as banks. So that experiment was an experiment of taking funds on mudaraba basis from depositors, and of course use it for investment to make profit, because mudaraba intends to make profit. So we made profit out of them through this investment with the local businessmen. So because we thought of that as a bank, we thought that bank should work only on mudaraba. So that bank should work only on risk sharing, that you take funds on mudaraba, you give funds on mudaraba, or even if you expand it a little beyond mudaraba, then go to musharaka also. So it has to be given on risk sharing. And until today, in fact, there are many writings who would say, oh, the foundation of Islamic finance is risk sharing, which is in fact, to me, kind of strange. I wouldn't claim that I am a faqih, but I do claim that I have a strong fiqh background and strong fiqh study. So it looks to me that very, very strange from the reality of fiqh, which is essentially the minute discussion or rulings or the directives of action for us in general. Now, if we look at another experience, experience of Tabung Haji. Tabung Haji in Malaysia came around the same time, even 1 year earlier than Meet Ghamar, but in the early 1960s. But Tabung Haji was never at all thought of as a bank. And it was considered as a fund and a management constituted, created by the government to help people go for Hajj. Part of helping them going for Hajj is to accumulate saving and to invest these savings. It was never thought of in Malaysia as a bank, and it was never treated as a bank until today, as a matter of fact. So we did not carry the same idea of putting fund to make it to grow and have it, use it for profit objectives. That was not carried on into the bank. When the first Islamic bank established in Malaysia, it took the sample of banks, Islamic banks that were created in the Middle East. It did not take the form of Tabung Haji. Banks in the Middle East, when they were established, the first commercial Islamic bank was established in Dubai. It could not function as a bank, as a matter of fact, for the first maybe 2 or 3 years. Continued to, instead of providing financing, they started trading real estate, buying properties, lands, and selling lands, until when the land prices got a crisis in Dubai, and land prices went down very drastically. The bank was on the verge of bankruptcy, or it was in fact in full bankruptcy, and unless it was salvaged by the founder of the bank, putting in more funds in it to salvage the bank. But the real process of Islamic banking came with the invention, we call it, of murabaha, with Sami Mahmoud, rahimahullah, and deservingly Sami Mahmoud was given the first prize of IDB in Islamic finance. He came with the Murabaha idea, as he quoted it from the Shafi'i book Al-Umm, and the Murabaha was really the savior of Islamic banking all the way since that time. And it carried then the idea of okay. So it carried the idea that the Murabaha creates convenience for as a base of Islamic bank. Now, when Islamic banks started existing in several countries, of course, it was obvious that we should use or these banks will use the expertise of some of the shuyukh. I hope that some of you may read my paper on the alliance between Islamic capitalist and Sharia scholarship. The Sharia scholars at the beginning, of course, and continuously, always, all the time, advised Islamic banks that they should use sale contracts, and of course they can use also mudaraba and musharaka and so on. Unfortunately, ijara came late, and it didn't really come until the mid-90s. That's about 20 years after the beginning of Islamic banks. Ijara came as another channel for Islamic finance, and it took its place, as a matter of fact, next to sale, and musharaka and mudaraba declined to be the least applied in Islamic finance. Islamic finance, as derived from the Sharia principles, uses three channels of financing. These three channels are sale channels, lease channels, and sometimes, rarely, the major part is sale, and then next to it is ijara or leasing, and then the least one is musharaka and mudaraba, or sharing in general. But when we look at these three channels of finance, we will notice also in them that they really, the common thing between them, the three of them, is ownership. You can sell after you buy. And of course, you buy means you become an owner, and then you sell. The same thing, you can give on leasing, you can give on ijara, a property, an asset, of course, after you own it. And if you don't own it, you cannot give it on ijara. And the same thing when you create an enterprise or a project or a business, or when you expand it on the basis of musharaka or mudaraba. Also, we should notice that it is by virtue of owning that you deserve the profit. So when we look at these channels, we notice that owning a property, owning an asset, owning goods, it is what makes you make profit in finance, and without it, you cannot make profit. So, of course, lending is excluded, and obviously lending for increment, for profit, for additions is not acceptable in Sharia, and that is the meaning of the prohibition of interest. Very often we read in some books that the focus point of Islamic finance is the prohibition of interest. And that is logically, to me, is a wrong statement, in fact, because you cannot think of anything as being a main issue, and that thing itself is negative. Not doing a thing is not really, cannot be a focus point or a center point of any action and any project, and of course, any profit. By not making loans on interest basis, that doesn't make and doesn't define and does not really introduce what is finance. Unfortunately, you find that in many books, and this is kind of a puzzle to me. So when we think of these three channels, we notice that the common thing among them all is that they are based on ownership. So we look as ownership as a basis of finance. There can't be any profit. You cannot earn profit without owning an asset or goods or anything that is able to generate added value. And the added value is that profit that you make. Of course, I don't want to go into the semantic definitions between fiqh and economics. I mean, profit is return, is any increment, is not really as defined in fiqh, and we don't need to go into the fiqh definition of profit, ujra, or rent, profit, and ghalla, that they call the product of in agriculture. We don't want these differences. We mean here return as we know it in finance. You cannot have a return according to these three channels unless you own a property that is able to generate added value in a sense of real addition to the GDP of the country or of the society or whatever you call it. So here we talk about then ownership as basis of Islamic finance, and it means exactly that: ownership, but not risk sharing. Risk sharing that was carried in our minds for a long period, and it is still occupies a big chunk of the minds of many writers, that risk sharing is so important in the Islamic finance. Looks that it has really no importance at all, and it failed to be in the basic fundament of Islamic finance. Now, on the two sides of an Islamic financial institution, on the side of the resource mobilization, acquiring resources, we use resources, we acquire resources either on musharaka or on mudaraba. In both, we create ownership. And by virtue of that ownership, that those who provided funds on musharaka basis or those who provided fund on mudaraba basis, only on the basis of that ownership that they deserve profit, not on the basis of risk sharing. And we will look at the issue of risk and discuss it also, and notice that risk is like entitlement. Entitlement is the deservance of the earning. You are entitled to that earning because you own, not because you bear risk. And risk is similar to entitlement. Both of them are two facets of ownership. If you own a thing, you are exposed to the risk that this thing is exposed to. And of course, you are entitled to any increment that is that may take place in that asset, in that property that you own. I like to go a little bit beyond the issue of finance. We look at ownership as really a fundamental thing that allows you or entitles you to earn a return. Even when we talk about service, when you provide service that you own, you earn also wage on it. Even with that, you, by providing that, call it factors of production, you earn a return. And then the idea of ownership goes beyond finance to be also in Islamic economics as a fundamental thing. One of the causes of value creating is a property. Of course, the other cause is labor. The labor, but labor also is associated with being provided as a service, is not independent from the idea of being provided into the production as a service, as one of the factors of production. And then owners of factors of production, by virtue of ownership, deserve their returns. So the theory then of ownership does not only apply in finance, it applies also in production. It applies also in distribution, as a matter of fact. The functional distribution of the factors of production, or to the factors of production, is based also on the ownership principle. You own the service that you provide, and you deserve the price of that service. You own a machine that you provide in the production, and you deserve the return of that machine, and so on. It goes on for all factors of production. So ownership is the basis of getting return or earning. Now, why does the lender not able to deserve in our Islamic economics any return? A lender may sometimes share risk. And there is a suggestion, there is a book by some writers that in it they suggest that the lenders in America should share with the borrowers in house financing the market risk of the item they financed. And even if they share, first of all, let's start with the idea that a lender, of course, bears a risk, bears credit risk. But in addition to bearing a credit risk, if a lender shares the market risk, does that justify his earning? It does not. The principle in our Sharia is that since the lender does not own a property that is able to generate additional value, added value, then the lender it does not deserve any part of added value, because there is no added value that is created to begin with. The lender owns a debt, and the debt does not generate added value. The debt, by its nature, is not able to create increments, and therefore a lender is not in a position to deserve any increment. So the theory goes, in fact, in a consistent way all through. Even if the lender shares the market risk, still the lender should not deserve, because the lender does not own an asset that generates added increment. If you take the idea of risk sharing, perhaps we should allow the lender to be, if the lender shares that risk, we should allow the lender to earn then interest on his loans. If we consider the idea of risk sharing as a basis for Islamic finance, this is one of the flaws also of that risk sharing concept. So why did the proposition of risk sharing fail in Islamic finance? Actually, in reality, Islamic finance went through murabaha, went through ijara, and very little bit of it went through musharaka or ijara. And even when it does, it is the fundament of owning a property that generates increment is what justifies even in mudaraba and in musharaka. But when we look at why the proposition failed, first and most obvious, of course, because risk sharing does not accommodate consumer financing. You cannot finance consumer on risk sharing, although there were some attempts by some writers that we finance building of human capital. I mean, they use the term human capital, although it is human being, but human capital, building human capital can be also shared. So you share the return of that human capital if you finance the construction of that capital through, for instance, education. So you can educate a person and then later share his salary or his return, his income in the market. That was a proposition that was rejected by everybody and tolerated, in fact, because it was called that they applied to it, actually all scholars, the idea of akil amwal al-nas bil batil, taking part of the properties of the earning of somebody without any reason at all, because you can't really share the human abilities. So risk sharing concept failed in accommodating consumer finance. Risk is not able to generate added value. This is the essential thing. Risk is not a property and is not a thing that can generate added value. And it is really not a thing that can be traded and not a thing that can be owned. Do you own risk? Do you handle risk as separate from an item or as separate from action or property? It cannot be separated from action or property, and risk alone then cannot be traded and cannot be owned and cannot be considered, cannot generate any added value. This is one of the implications of this, is that we do not accept the sale of risk in insurance. And the idea of selling risk when it is risk alone, of course, this is in insurance, it's clear it becomes risk alone. It cannot be really, for risk to mitigate risk, we cooperate to mitigate risk rather than we sell risk. Risk sharing does not accommodate the need for definite cash flow. In the finance business, you need definite cash flow. And if you cannot produce a good expectation of a definite cash flow then it doesn't work really in finance. So you and risk sharing does not accommodate that, both in terms of the amount of cash flow and in terms of its due date. Risk sharing is not compatible with the regulations that are common in banking and finance. Preference of risk sharing is not compatible with human nature. Human nature is to avoid risk as much as you can. And risk sharing is even worse than bearing risk, because risk sharing, you are carrying the risk also of another person, which the Quran gave a negative description on it when it says the term shuraka'u mutashakisun, that there is likelihood, whether it is more common or less common is really immaterial. There is likelihood that partners may have differences and may have disputes among themselves. So is it better then to be in a position of exposed to this kind of disputes among partners, or it is better that you own your property, you bear your own risk, and when you sell the property, it becomes owned by the other person, the buyer, and the buyer bears its risk then. So you transfer the risk with the property, and then you have nothing to do with that risk. There is no concept of sharing. So the concept of sharing itself is not really consistent with the human fitra, with the human nature. Risk sharing is more costly than risk aversion, as a matter of fact. This is well-known fact, but no, I want to say one more thing here, which I read in a recent paper by one of the good writers, as a matter of fact, but sometimes everyone has some pitfalls. The writer says that we need regulations by the central banks that would force Islamic banks to make to provide finance on mudaraba and on musharaka. And of course, when you do that, there is also additional cost for these regulations. And who should bear this additional cost? And why should we need regulations to force them to take more risk? And the natural thing and the fitra is to take less risk. And the fitra also is not to share risk rather than sharing risk. We share risk only when we need to, and out of really kind of necessity. When the size of the firm cannot work without sharing, then we pool resources together and we share risk to create the appropriate size of the firm. But that's another issue really. But again here, the fitra is to avoid risk, not to, rather than to sharing. Non-predictability of risk sharing may cause monetary and financial disturbances, and that is observed, of course, in the market. So that creates an additional burden on the market. Risk-return relationship is not a causality relationship. It's rather an accompanying relationship. Risk accompanies higher risk, accompanies higher potential return, but it is not the cause of higher potential return. The cause of the return is what you own, and that is that ownership that created the addition or the return. Risk is of multiple layers and multiple levels and multiple kinds. Which one that should be shared, and where and why? Lastly, the failure to distinguish between market risk and ownership risk. In Sharia, continuously, I should say, and across the board, we talk about ownership risk, not really risk sharing. Ownership risk is a sign or a test. We take it sometimes as a test. It's a sign and a test of completion of the ownership. You may own a thing, but if you don't bear its risk, then your ownership is incomplete. Like when you buy an item, but you did not take delivery yet of it. The owner, the risk of that item remains with the seller until the seller makes that delivery. And once you take delivery, then we consider that, then only you can deserve any increment that may happen in it. But before that, you do not deserve that increment because your ownership is not even complete. So we consider, we take the risk bearing as a test of completion of ownership and not really as a reason for the creation of the addition. Now, in the property theory of finance, none of price risk, liquidity risk, or credit risk may justify earning. What justifies earning is the ownership, and that is associated with the ownership risk, creation or the existence of an increment in an owned property. If an increment happens in an owned property, then you deserve that increment. The owner deserves that increment. This is what both the maqasid and the individual text of Sharia require and ordain. Obviously, ownership risk is there, but also it is not shared. It is not the sharing concept. There is a risk, obviously, you have to bear risk, but you don't have to share risk. And of course, without bearing risk, you cannot, your ownership is not complete, and therefore you cannot create any earning out of that property. We are then talking about a new theory of finance, a theory that has its economic and legal foundations derived from this religion, not derived really from any experience outside our religion, from the text and understanding the religion. Entitlement for return is caused by ownership of a property, and those who own property can deserve the or do deserve the return of that property. This is a general theory in Islamic finance, Islamic economics and finance. It applies all through, including production, its factors, distribution, development, and creation of added value. The three channels of finance, sale, leasing, and sharing, translate into four axiomatic principles. These are earning by owning. Financial assets are mere representation of what do they represent. And we will see that we apply to them really the rules of what they represent, as if financial assets do not exist at all. We do not recognize them. As a matter of fact, I would say to the extent that we in Islamic economics and finance are blindfolded toward financial assets. We only treat them as mere representation of the real assets. The principle, the realism, also the axiom of realism and the axiom of moral commitment. These are not maqasid al-sharia and not part of the maqasid. These are fundamentals of Islamic finance. These three channels of finance also imply that the characteristics of return in Islamic finance are, there is a necessary condition, a necessary characteristic that without which there will be no return in finance at all in Islamic finance, that is owning a property, a goods or assets or anything that is able to generate added value. So the sufficient conditions are the property should be able to generate increment and the property should be able to pass the moral test. This also implies that financial securities are mere representation of their underlying real assets. They are not, financial assets are not assets in themselves. We always look at what do they represent and apply the rules of their underlying assets all the time. And we don't, I mean, this is the famous example is how do we deal with a share? A share in a company is of today is not like a share of the same company of tomorrow, although the number of share is still the same. But we look at not at the share, we look at what the share represents, and the share represents is the total assets minus total liabilities. And when we talk about assets, including market capitalization. So we always look at that, at financial assets as mere representation, not really added assets. Islamic finance is then a universal reform of finance. It is finance for the real economy. And of course, when we look at Islamic finance as such, again, there is something missing. I don't know how it is now, how these slides are moving. Really, it looks to me that something is doing something funny. Okay. Now, anyway, upon recognizing this new theory of Islamic finance, property theory of Islamic finance, we need anew to deal with the risk, with development, with the ethical and moralities in finance, and also with the issue of contribution to society. These are four areas that Islamic finance has been under scrutiny and under a lot of discussion by many writers who do not really, and I would always accuse them that they do not fundamentally refer to the Sharia itself. They refer to ideas that are strange from Sharia. So let's deal with these one by one in a quick way. Risk and Islamic finance. The risk issue and risk map in finance have always to undertake deep changes based on the property theory. It is, risk is a fact of life, and it is a fact of life that life is surrounded with and paved with by risk, a matter which makes risk management a part of the venture of life itself in our whatever we do. So we deal with risk all the time, and we always manage risk all the time in actions or in properties in all our activities. How do we deal with risk in Islamic finance? Risk is not an asset. No risk trading, no risk sale, and no risk exchange insurance contract. That is why the Islamic alternative is to cooperate to mitigate risk rather than to sell risk. No exchange contract in risk. Justice requires earn by owning, and owner bears property risk. So there is a risk that you bear, but you bear property risk as an owner and not in any other capacity. Islamic banks have to bear ownership risk because they must own to earn, in addition to credit risk because they finance. Of course, when we talk about Islamic banks, they provide finance. And if you finance, that means definitely you have to bear a credit risk. But in addition to credit risk, in Islamic finance, we have to bear property risk. Without it, the profit is not justification. Now, credit risk and credit risk sharing do not justify earning in Islamic finance at all, even with the credit risk sharing. Number 4, there is no Sharia or legal or market requirement that Islamic banks or Islamic financial institutions must bear market, that is price and liquidity risks of or economic fluctuation risk. That's not their job. That's not their business. Number 5, wakala in Islamic financial institutions requires minimizing all kinds of risk. And of course, it requires avoiding risks that can be avoided, that are avoidable. Rules of prudence require advanced knowledge of cash inflow, both in size and in maturity, and also requires liquidity matching. Commercial Islamic banks or commercial banks, Islamic and others, have legal and economic responsibility to observe effects on monetary and economic system of their action or lack of action. So in other words, when you finance on mudaraba and you have unpredictable return, you may create a disturbance in the financial and monetary system. So we need to avoid these as much as that is possible. How do we deal with property risk? Definitely, property risk must be borne, must be taken. Without property risk, you don't earn, because property risk is attached all the time to ownership. It's a facet of ownership. It's a characteristic of ownership. If you don't have it, your ownership is not complete, and then you do not deserve any earning. So you must bear the property risk. Yet it can be minimized and it can be mitigated both ways. So you should minimize it as much as possible, and you should also mitigate it if it is better to mitigate it depending on the risk-bearing level. Market risk, both price and liquidity, can be avoided by focusing on debt-creating, value-generating, exit-definite product. these kind of product, debt creating, value generating, and exit definite. All these are necessary for any any commercial financial institution, and therefore you need to focus on these kind of product rather than on unpredictable product. As for the credit risk, definitely you have to bear credit risk. The issue of development, Islamic finance, there are talks that we should focus on financing investment. Risk sharing finances investment, finances businesses, and don't finance consumers. Where does this come from? Does it come from Sharia, or it comes from being in a backward country that we need to focus on growth more, on development? Now, if we were in America, probably we should focus on consumer financing better. And probably you may remember that America always criticizes China because of the low focus on consumer goods inside China, and instead the focus on investment and export. And always Americans always advise the Chinese that you should increase the level of living, the welfare of your own people, and don't leave them that poor. We have a precedent, in fact, by our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he asked the question, who among you the property of his heir is more dear to him than own property? So they said, none of us, Ya Rasulullah. Definitely none of us. We prefer our own property over the property of our heirs. He said, then your property is what you eat and consume, what you wear and tear, and what you give for charity and keep for yourself with God. But the property of your heirs, what you leave behind. So why should you leave behind? Then enjoy it, eat, and wear and live comfortably. That's what the Prophet ﷺ advised, and you really don't need to leave anything to your heirs. Now, especially when your heirs are grown up, like my case, for instance, definitely, why should I leave any property to my children? They are all grown up, they have their own families, they have their own income, they have their own properties. So why should I worry anymore? I have worried about them for 50 years, and that's plenty of worry. I don't need to worry for more than that. So it is the advice of the Prophet. Use your own property. Don't leave it to your heirs. The idea is a preference between consumption and investment is a temporary preference, or call it a temporal rather preference, depending on the situation in the economy you live in. If you live in an economy that is developing and growing with high level of poverty, then you may focus on investment more. But if you live in an economy that is not like that, you may have to focus more on consumption. So why we prefer investment over consumption? There is no Sharia reason. There may be circumstantial reasons, and these circumstantial reasons are determined by two kinds of bodies, either by the society in its totality, along with its government, with its representations, and they decide that we want to focus on investment for some important reason, or by the individual, where each individual will create his own priorities on his own self. And then, as I mentioned a moment ago, definitely my priority now is not to leave any property, is not investment, is rather consumption. and following the advice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that my property is what I consume myself, and the property of my heir is what I leave behind. Why should I leave anything behind? I don't need really to leave anything behind. So it is an individual decision or a society decision. And then, of course, when it is a society decision, individual units in that society must follow the collective decision, must abide by that collective decision. So calling on Islamic banks that you should prefer investment financing over consumer financing is calling on the wrong party to take an action that doesn't belong to them. This action, if it is collective, belongs to the whole society and its government, and then everybody should abide by that. Or it is individual, then as a financial institution that aims at making profit, it seeks where the profit is higher. It doesn't seek what is investment or consumption finance. It shouldn't make any difference. Islamic finance to consumers is, or to business, is developmental. Let's remember that. Even when you finance consumption, you give the signal market to the producers to produce more. So it is developmental. We don't claim, and we shouldn't really claim, that's a communist claim, used to be anyway in the past, that consumer goods are not productive. They are only consumed. They are bought, and by being bought, they give the signal to the market to produce more. So Islamic finance, by its sticking to financing real economy only, is developmental. Conventional finance does not stick to financing real economy. Let's remember, and let's know it, and I'm sure one of our students should maybe prove it in the statistically. Most of the financing of conventional banks is interbanks financing and debt financing, debt-based, that is rescheduling of debts. That doesn't exist at all in Islamic finance. There is no rescheduling of debts, and we only finance goods and services that always, with each bit of finance in the Islamic finance, we give a market signal to producers to produce more. So there is a big difference. Don't think of our institutions in the same terms you think of the conventional banks, because the composite of their activities are quite different. Islamic finance, by its nature, returns and keep financial and human resources in the productive real sector. All these resources that are used in the fiction and in the many transactions, interest-based transactions and debt-based transactions, all these transactions, by eliminating them, resources that are used in them are definitely have no place to do other than the real economy, other than the real market. So what do they do other than that? They will produce goods and services, and then this is, in my opinion, the best way to really, if you want to eliminate poverty in the world, we have to implement Islamic finance everywhere in the world, so that no resources would be ever used, financial resources or human resources would ever be used in the fictitious markets. And the fictitious markets are not small. One market alone takes at least 11 times the amount of the global GDP. one item alone. Yani take options alone, and options are simply and as simple as that. They don't exist in the Islamic finance. They don't exist in the Islamic economics at all. So when we apply Islamic finance, there will be no options at all, meaning the $1,200 trillion used in options have no other place to do and to make profit other than the real market. There's nothing, there's no opportunity to make profit other than the real market. Would there be any remaining poverty if we increase the productive capacity by all these trillions of dollars? Yani imagine it. Islamic finance, we reject, of course, in Islamic economics, extravagance and wasteful use of resources, but the Islamic economic system does not impose a preference of investment over consumption over any individual. As a system, there is no preference. If there are circumstantial situations that create a collective decision to prefer one aspect over another, then economic units, individuals, and banks and other institutions should abide by this collective decision. Rather, it recognizes that the objective of production and ownership is final consumption. Final consumption is, of course, as the Prophet mentioned, is the objective of ownership and also the objective of production. And it encourages enjoying it. The Islamic economic system encourages enjoying final consumption using your own property and using your own means. Okay, and that hadith which I mentioned already. Islamic finance and its Islamic financial institutions do not support harmful things. By not supporting harmful things, aren't we saving the society from the expenditures that are spent to deal with these harms, to treat these harms? Yani to say, for instance, the accidents that happens in America because of alcoholic or because of drinking, driving. The cost of these, the cost of repairing them, the cost of treating these hurts, these damages, whether in bodies or in properties. How much is it? All this, we are saving this. Isn't that developmental? Is it not developmental itself when we do not finance harmful things? We finance means we restrict financing only to useful things, things that benefit human beings. So this is developmental itself. We shouldn't really shy from saying it in a clear way. Individuals by their fitrah are the ones who have always personal inner incentives to create value, to add to their own wealth. They like to become richer and have more. That is described in the Quran and everywhere. We know that, and every economist also know that. These incentives create wealth. These incentives create development and growth, and the Islamic economic system encourages them to increase the welfare of the society. Government are responsible for setting macroeconomic policies. Individual economic units should abide by that, including Islamic financial institutions and so on. It is neither rational nor fair nor appropriate to charge bankers and finance providers with the task of deciding between investment and consumption, or between consumption today and consumption tomorrow. This is a job or a function of individuals and government. Bankers' job is to make profit for their depositors and shareholders by facilitating the job of individuals and government. Bankers are not the ones who determine, who take the decision of preferring consumption over investment or investment over consumption. The moral dimension of Islamic finance, again, there are many writings that say, oh, the moral dimension of Islamic finance is doubtful, and you guys are not contributing to the moral values in the society and the economy. I definitely bring the attention to the points that are very important in this regard. Islamic finance is moral by the fact that it is derived from Sharia. And definitely our Sharia is the most moral conduct system that ever existed in the world. There is no other system for conduct, for human behavior that is more moral than our Sharia. And Islamic finance is derived from it. There is no sense to any claim that Islamic finance does not emphasize positive moral contribution to society, of positive morality, only negative morality, because many people talk about don't make riba, don't make gharar. Unfortunately, yes, very often, more people, my son the other day, my son, by the way, and he has PhD in Sharia. So he was objecting to a statement that we all used to say it, that when we eat, Bismillah, Allahumma waqina adab an-nar. He said, what is the relation of taking food to qina adab an-nar? Leave qina adab an-nar to another setting. Not when you eat. When you eat, say, Allahumma barik lana fima razaqtana waj'alna natamatta' bihadha at-ta'am. God, give us blessing of this food and make us enjoy this food. Why do you mention and make us avoid the hellfire? Pray against the hellfire in another setting, not in the setting when you want to eat. When you want to eat and you want this food to be blessed to you, you don't want, it has nothing to do with make us avoid the hellfire. So that doesn't mean we don't pray to make us avoid the hellfire, but be positive here. You don't need to bring the negative aspect everywhere you go. So unfortunately, many of us, the writers on Islamic finance, they emphasize always the conditions in Islamic finance. There should be no riba and no gharar. You have to avoid riba and avoid gharar and avoid other prohibited sales. Well, for God's sake, the positive parts of it is a lot more important. Don't we produce good? Don't we in Islamic finance help producing goods that are useful to human beings? And we prevent goods that are bad, focusing on producing goods that are useful to human beings. Isn't that a moral value itself? Isn't that a good contribution itself? So don't focus on the negative things, please. Okay. And of course, we know that most beloved among you, as the Prophet ﷺ told us, are those who are most beneficial to God's creatures and to all creatures, in fact. Earning by owning is a very essential and fundamental ethical principle. It provides economic justice. Isn't that just that if you want to earn, you have to own something that can create increment? Of course, we are talking about finance here, not earning by your own job. I earn salary by teaching here in this university, not by this lecture, but by teaching it. But that is earning by job, by labor. But when we talk about finance, definitely finance earns by property, not by labor. So the prohibition of interest and other unjust practices also is a major achievement of Islamic finance today. Islamic financial institutions today have been able to show to the world that it is possible to create financial institutions without riba, and that riba is not the indispensable curse that we all have to be subject to. There were writers in the past. The latest writing of this kind was by one of the experts of the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia, which was written in the 1989 or 88. But before that, there were writing by many others that interest and the banking system that is based on interest is an indispensable curse. It is bad, but we cannot live without it. Many writers, Islamic writers, used to say that, including that one. I remember when that was published in a Saudi newspaper, the president of the Islamic Development Bank called on me and asked me, well, Monzer, can you write an answer to that? Can you make a reply? I want to publish a reply in my name, in his name. I told him I can, yes. And I did that, alhamdulillah, and it was published, and it was sent also to Sama, president, that a reply to that article. Definitely, the fact that we proved to the world that finance can be done without committing any of these criminal, morally criminal issues of charging interest or making any deceptive contracts and so on. Without them, yes, finance can be provided in a moral way without these practices. The next one is Islamic finance strongly and tightly embraces the principle of economic justice in all its transactions. And of course, what we do with non-permissible income is a sign always. All Islamic banks today, because they deal in a complex society and complex economy, and because they deal and they have to deal with conventional banks, sometimes may either make mistakes in their contract, and then to correct these mistakes, they take the earning to the non-permissible account, non-permissible income account, or because of the transactions with the conventional banks, and the advice is that these conventional banks better reduce whatever resources that are available to them. So take from them as much as you can within the law, of course. And if we have to deposit with them large sums of money, we would take the interest and give it to charity rather than keep it to them to use it to make more interest-based transactions. So the non-permissible income account exists in all Islamic financial institutions, and it is definitely a proof that they commit themselves to the principle of justice, and any unjust thing that happens to be in their hands, they do not use it for their own selves. Rather, they give it to charity. Of course, we don't give it to the one who paid it. We don't give interest back to the one who paid it, because that person will make fool out of us, and we will be betraying our objective by increasing its resources. Rather, we give it to charity, but we don't gain it, we don't earn it. Avoidance of harmful things and adopting scientific, not theological, and I insist on this point. Our criteria of what is moral and what is not moral is not theological, is not religious, is not based on doctrine. It is based on what is harmful and what is not harmful. And the Quran clearly said that. إثمهما أكبر من نفعهما. And we know that on that basis, we do not finance things that did not come in the Quran, yet science proved that they are harmful, so we avoid them, we avoid financing them. The next point is Islamic financial institutions and Islamic banks are mere agents, and they require authorization and disclosure for any less than profit maximization activity. I gave them the money as a depositor to make profit for me. So any action that is less than profit maximization requires a permit from me, because they are only agent. And in Mudaraba, you know, the Mudarib is only an agent. So agency contract does not allow Islamic financial institutions to give donations, not anything beyond the normal. And Sharia advisement need to observe social and environmental responsibility. The last point, I'm sorry, probably I am taking too much time of yours, but the last point, we can make it quickly. The contribution to society. Being a property-based Islamic finance support the production and exchange of goods and services that benefit societies and the humanities. This is an important point that we must emphasize it all the time. All our activities in Islamic finance, definitely all our activity, and exclusively, there is none of the Islamic finance that goes beyond that. All our activities in Islamic finance go to produce, to support the production and exchange of goods and services, of course, that are beneficial to humanity. We do not do anything other than that. That's the job. Does that job fulfill the objectives of Sharia, or are we away from the objectives of Sharia? I mean, any claim of not fulfilling the objectives of Sharia by supporting the production of goods and services that are of benefit to humanities, definitely this is within the objective of Sharia. By rejecting to finance any bad things and actions, Islamic finance embraces social welfare. Again, on the positive and the negative side, both of them are contributions to society. The fact that Islamic finance eliminates interest and other harmful practices, including practices that do not generate any income but waste resources, of course, all the energy, at least even the human energy that is put in them is not justified. Things that are a gambling type of activities that only transfer wealth from one person to another without adding wealth at all. The fact that Islamic finance eliminates interest and other harmful practices such as zero-sum transactions, Islamic finance make a substantial contribution to justice and against economic exclusiveness in the society. The social responsibility is an important issue and applies to all members of society, whether legal or natural persons, banks, all banks, Islamic or conventional banks are included. I find several writings that talk Islamic banks do this and that and the other of being not good to the society, which what is claimed is wrong on one hand, but again, Why don't you talk about conventional banks? What do they do of harms to the society? Why are you targeting Islamic banks and not targeting all banks, and all wrongdoing or wrongdoers in the society? Why pinpointing the Islamic banks alone? All persons, legal and natural, are expected to consider the externalities of their actions. And if an Islamic bank does not consider the externality of its action, then definitely that Islamic bank is wrong. And we should advise it not to do that. But that doesn't mean we do not, that we incriminate these banks without incriminating similar wrongdoers in the economy. Respect of human rights and rejection of discrimination against women, youth, elderly, the color or anything are expected from and should be forced on all social unit, all societies unit, whether they are Islamic or not. And those Islamic institutions that, or those institutions in the society that do not observe that, definitely should be condemned and should be, even by law, should be punished and forced to take the right action. I come to a conclusion with this, and thank you very much. Sorry for taking more time than I expected, but I think the issue is important, and we are talking about really a new vision of Islamic finance that has not been emphasized before. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. I'll be glad to answer any questions if you have any questions from you or from people also who are with us on the Zoom. Okay. No questions? Thank you. That's fine. Then we go for Asr prayer. It's not yet Asr. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, even objections are welcome, and we will discuss them. Go ahead.
Yes, in terms of practical implications on the Islamic banking activity itself, does that mean that the equity of the banks itself should be put in the transactions and increased, maybe because the current size of the banks is no way commensurate, at least in the conventional sector, but maybe also in Islamic finance, commensurate with their activities? So having more ownership-based transactions means that the size of their capital should be commensurate with their activity as well in terms of banking. So should we drag more equity? Should we increase the capital size of the banks as well? Is it one of the considerations?
I think the immediate implication of this discussion is that we really need to adjust our understanding of Islamic banks and adjust our expectations from Islamic banks. So when we read in a balance sheet that most of the activities of an Islamic banks are murabaha, we should be happy, not we should be upset and call on the bank that you should increase musharaka. Why should they increase musharaka? So this is the immediate implication. But if we want to talk about certain other issues where the Islamic banks need to be improved, I should say, yes, there are areas of improvement that are required in Islamic banks, especially in the area of educating the Sharia scholars who advise Islamic banks on the true issues of Islamic finance being ownership-based. So when they understand that well, some of their fatwas should be adjusted. So definitely there are fatwas that violate this principle, and these fatwas should be changed and should be corrected. So this is another one. The other thing is that because of lack of education on several social issues that are in our societies today, unfortunately, the mindset of our, I should say most of our ulama, instead of saying all, probably all, really, not most. The mindset is created by the books that are written several centuries ago. Their mindset is not addressed to issues of our society today. And there are issues definitely in our societies today, including these issues of discrimination against certain categories in a society that may exist in some of the Muslim societies. That is clear, that exist, in fact, in some of the Muslim societies. So Islamic banks, Islamic financial institutions should be aware, and their Sharia advisors should be very aware of these, so they avoid any discrimination in these institutions. Again, the environmental issues, they are important to all societies today, and they should be emphasized also. We need probably, through more education, to understand really what are the what should be the Islamic financial institutions that are profit-making, what should they be doing? I have an example, for instance, in Qatar. I lived there for 10 years, and there are several non-banking companies that commit themselves to the Islamic Sharia and seek always Sharia advice in their activities. So in most other societies, you don't see that. We need, in other words, companies also to commit themselves to the Islamic Sharia, especially that we live in societies that has many things that have become mixed, many violations of Sharia, many immoral things that are done in our societies, unfortunately, and our Sharia advisors of Islamic banks may not be aware of them. If they are made aware of them, they will advise their banks to do better than they are doing now. The issue of property theory, in fact, if we understand the property theory, definitely many of the fatwa that are given in Islamic banking today, here in Turkey and in many other countries, unfortunately, should be adjusted, should be really changed, because they contradict the ownership theory of finance.